need to ask James to come to the stage as well. We need to ask Andrew Taylor. And I think we're going to invite Niall Rowan as well, seeing as you're mic'd up, Niall, and I think you missed the first session, just in case you can add some value to the debate. Now, we are running a little bit late, but I think this is probably worth spending a little bit of time on. There's a lot to get through there. I think, some interesting conversations coming out of the modular volumetric industry. Andy has obviously given us a quick canter through the world that currently where we are in terms of what will affect us as an industry. And Kate has sort of dropped the truth bomb of what the world is, or the landscape is going to look like in terms of competency in the academic pathway. So I think there's probably a bit to get through. So I forgive us now if it does run on a little bit, just because I think there may be some quite good engagement going on. So we have Tony to my left with the green ball. We have Rich to my right with the yellow ball. Could I have a quick hand up, please, for the first question? Gentleman in the pink, Mr. Barry Beavis, I believe. It's all right, I'll come to you, sir.
Good afternoon. I just want to check with regards to the validating of competence. That appears to me to be a register where people can access and presumably pay to be registered to demonstrate competency and almost wear an ASFP badge. Who's checking that?
Kate, is that a question for you?
So I think as I said, we're in the early stages of this process. So the scheme rules still need to be put in place and we need to determine exactly who is doing what. I think the idea is that we would put in place some clear benchmarks in terms of evidence. So we'd work with industry to say what needed to be reached and what evidence needed to be submitted. In terms of who checks that evidence, checking that it has been submitted and it complies with the benchmark that have been set, I think would be down to ASFP, or certainly that's the current thinking, in terms of checking that everything is there and everything has been submitted. Who creates that benchmark in the first place? That's what we're working with industry on.
And my fear would be that Paul is quite qualified, but Peter does the upload. Peter now wears the badge.
So it would be done based on individual, not based on the person who submits the evidence. We'd have to see evidence that was linked to the individual who was going to be registered for the competence.
Precisely, but there doesn't appear to be a check there to make sure that the person who's doing the upload has the competency.
So that's part of what we'll build into the scheme rules. There will be a mechanism to make sure that we are checking that the evidence belongs to the person who it's being registered for as part of that process. What that looks like and the rules that we set around that are still yet to be defined, but we absolutely do need to do that as part of setting the scheme up.
Perfect, thank you.
I think with like anything, a bit like ISO 9001, for instance, the framework is set that you are then audited against. So there's a process of setting the framework that then would have to be, then you would be measured against. And of course, then we would be measured against our measuring of individuals or companies against that framework.
But the purpose, Mike, is that we're driving up standards.
So
this needs to be a robust enough system to be able to stop anybody from being able to circumnavigate.
Yeah.
And, because there might be some people out there that may not have the correct competency, but are trying to hoodwink other people that they do have.
Heaven forbid,
Exactly.
Mr.
Exactly.
Somebody would even
Precisely.
think about doing that.
Mike, is it not worth mentioning that we are looking to recruit someone to conduct that?
I'm sorry, Andy, I'm too busy.
There is a number of levels to this. So one of the things we're going through at the moment is looking to recruit a compliance and quality manager that will help support the scheme. And even to the point that we'll then take it to the next stage, which is actually us as an organisation that runs the scheme gets audited by effectively a fourth party. So we will be completely transparent with this scheme because it has to be transparent. It's not us just effectively trying to ring fence something and be the slave and the master to it. Gentleman with the yellow ball.
Yeah, Judith Hackett's report talks a lot about competency, and the Building Safety Act talks about competency. So why won't the government bring forward legislation and make it a legal requirement that when you've got contractors undertaking fire safety work, they are actually registered and third-party certified, and their operatives are as well?
Mr.
Yeah,
Niall Rowan, I think
guess
you're
it's a
quite
rhetorical
passionate
question.
about that particular question.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that rhetorical question. We have asked them to do this.
For 20 years.
And their attitude has often been, their attitude is that they haven't always seen third-party certification as the answer, because there are things out there that are third-party certified that aren't working, allegedly. And so that's been their case. Their worry is that the third-party schemes haven't got enough rigour behind them. So, that's why we're trying to get ahead of the curve.
But they could legislate to make the third-party schemes more effective and efficient then, if they think they're not, couldn't they?
Well, they could do. I think there's a bit of case of not invented here syndrome. For example, we promoted third-party certification for products. Andrew was talking earlier about safety-critical products. And if you look at the list of attributes that the government put down for safety-critical products and the list of attributes for third-party certification, it's 85% the same. I'm thinking, well, why don't you just well, they didn't invent that, so they're going to call it safety-critical product. Third-party certification, certainly in the product systems, has a major role to play. But I think work is needed on the installer side.
Yeah, I think it's evidence of competency or third-party certification on schemes for installation has been some way behind products. Saying that, of course, what you're talking about relies on the certifying bodies, which are commercial businesses in their own right, to pick up those schemes relating to each discipline or product or function. Now, there are some products or some disciplines within passive fire that has got a very low ceiling in terms of commercial opportunity to those certifying bodies, so they are less attractive to them to pick up. So you end up with a situation where 80% of the industry has a third-party scheme that is supported by, IFC, Warrington, UL, and there's a 20% sector where it's not commercially attractive to those businesses to run those third-party schemes, because maybe there's only 3 or 4 manufacturers or there's only half a dozen installers that do that particular work, because of course our world can be very pointed and quite specific in certain areas. So I think that there is a risk that certain parts of it will be missed because the certifying bodies that have been asked to do it don't want them because it's not commercially attractive.
It's difficult though. I mean, we insist on any contract that we let that the contractors and the operatives have that third-party certification, and we get challenged quite frequently by the contractors saying, well, it's not a legislative requirement.
No, it isn't.
And we say, well, that might not be, but it's our requirement.
But it's your best practice requirement, and you stick to your guns, and I applaud you for doing it. Yeah. So thank you. Next question, gentleman at the back with a green ball. Hello.
Thank you. Just to pick up on the competence framework that you're doing, have you considered the government standards for running a competence person scheme?
Yeah, so there are lots of different inputs into it. There's government standard for competent person schemes. There's BSI Flex 8670. There's also a lot of the existing competence frameworks or occupational standards that will play into it. So it's not about supplanting what's already there. It's about taking all the elements of what's there and bringing it together.
If you look at the conditions of authorisation, condition 3, condition 9, condition 12, you look at the minimum competence requirements, you look at the UCAS CIS 7, the one thing that's absolutely common is people should be assessed, this is government and UCAS, against national occupational standards. So what I couldn't see there is who's going to stand there with the clipboard, what's on the clipboard, and what's the authority of the person. What should be on the clipboard, so government are telling us, the national occupational standards, the health and safety, and then the discipline. Yeah. We're then into learning development standards, which would be standard 9 and standard 11, which would answer that gentleman's question over there. Who's monitoring it? That's internal quality and external quality. So I think when you're looking to actually make a comment about standards, I think we need to be quite clear across our sector, where is the benchmark? And at the minute, government and the Sector Skills Council keep saying national occupational standards. And until they're changed, I wouldn't recommend anyone step away from that.
No, and I agree. And that's part of the reason that we said that we have to take into account the nationally recognised qualifications that already exist, which are based on those national occupational standards. Yeah. There's a question of whether or not those standards need to be altered, which I think we need to address with the standard setting bodies if there are any issues that are identified there. but we do need to take that into account already. And part of the reason that we separated qualifications from recognised training in terms of the competence framework is that they already come with their own external quality assurance mechanisms through Ofqual and their internal quality assurance mechanisms through the awarding organisations as well.
Yeah, the other thing that you want to consider at some point, certainly with upskilling, is when we're making a judgment on someone, i.e. performance and knowledge, what are we going to do when they're not at that point? So for me, all third-party certification organisations, the next 3 to 5 years, will need upskilling programmes. I know that's difficult from the conflict of interest, you know, I appreciate that, but that's what they need to be flexible. But there's quite a few third-party organisations out there at the minute who wouldn't even know what the health and safety national occupational standards are for construction. The other quick thing I'd just say, we're raising competency. I think we've all had problems over the last 25 years. Where's our apprenticeship programmes? We keep making, if like, comments about people not being competent, not compliant. I think the challenge for us all is we need to go back and start putting apprenticeship programmes so we're not having the same problem in 5 to 7 years.
And I think that's a really good point, and that's why we were saying that we need your input as well, because if this is the feeling that's out there in the sector, if these are the things that are missing, if you can highlight those, we can work on them with you.
Oh, they won't let me on the table, Kate. It's a nightmare. I keep asking now, they keep throwing me away. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't think anyone will argue with your comments about apprenticeships. I think over the last, I think one of the impacts of the cost of living crisis is that our country was turned into very much of a service industry driven economy, finance, retail. And we stepped away from manufacturing and engineering to a certain degree. It all moved abroad. We've relied on cheap, imports, cheap labour. Brexit saw an end to effectively, more affordable European labour. And the reality is coming home to bite that you can't have a cheap economy run on service industries. You've got to invest in things that actually have significant tangible value to them and train the people to deliver that tangible value. That's just
to follow up on it, with great respect, I think, fair play to the ASFP. If I'm the government, I'm going to the Sector Skills Council, whose remit is to look after the sector, apprenticeships, provision, standards and qualifications. Where is the Sector Skills Council's input? Certainly in building engineering services. So for me, I think the Sector Skills Council have a lot of accountability. I can, take the point of the ASFP driving it forward, but you need a lot of collaborations and help from me.
Yeah, and we have been talking with CITB as well. So,
yeah. I mean, this is a collaborative approach.
Yeah.
I managed to say collaborative twice and getting it right. I'll ask Steve to say binoculars when he comes up on the stage in a minute. That we could be here a while. Thank you for that question. Next question, please. Do we have a yellow board? Hello, sir.
Hi. What kind of time period are you looking at for development of this competency framework? Because one of the issues that we have with our particular product is there's very little qualification and training actually available in the industry itself. So, it's going to be very difficult to demonstrate competency because we haven't got the training facilities available to provide those.
Yeah, I don't know what your particular product is, but I think you're right. One of the things that this will also do, as well as highlighting routes to competence that already exist, is highlight where the gaps are. And we're going to need to fill those. In terms of timescales, I think a bit of a woolly answer to that is as quickly as possible. We know that, I talked about it ranging across all of those kind of domains of passive fire protection, if you like. We know that it's not going to be possible to do all of those all at once straight away. We're going to have to kind of eat the elephant. So I think looking at installation to start with and probably moving out from there. But I think if there are particular, I'm just looking at Steve here, I think if there are particular issues that you know about now that you want to raise, it's probably better to raise those early on and have that conversation with us so we know what those issues are.
What is the framework within the ASFP for this development then?
How will it take place? That's a good question. So I'm trying to think of the best way to answer it.
Well, I mean, we're going to start to communicate with our members about this. So our engagement will start with our membership and we'll be seeking engagement, comment, views, ideas about what Kate's talking about in terms of any gaps or anything that we see can be aligned to on anything on top of what we're already doing. We're creating a whole series of courses. We've already laid out the framework and the courses that we're going to develop, which will either lead to a qualification through taking an exam, or will be continuous professional development. A lot of that is aligned to different professional organisations and how they consume skills and knowledge. So your professional organisations of RIBA, RSCS, Institute of Fire Safety Managers, CABE, those members tend to consume CPD because their entry to the industry is generally quite high. It's generally postgraduate. On the other side of the spectrum, we're looking at actual practical training in terms of the overarching disciplines of passive fire. So one of our members, I think it's London Fire, if you've been to one of the trade shows, you can actually get your hands dirty on their trade stand. And they have I've mentioned it a couple of times in our broadcasts, they have a strap line that says passive makes perfect. And I still lose sleep over not coming up with that one myself, but they've got it, so that's the end of that. But so there's going to be a course that's related to actually doing that, and we've invested in significant assets to help us to achieve that as well. That could be supported either by CPD or by an actual ASFP certificate, or actually it could actually be led to an exam, an IFE exam, in terms of either evidencing your practical ability. So there's a whole series of different mechanisms depending on where your start point is, what your discipline is, and what you do within the industry. Because we have become a lot more diverse as an industry. I blame myself for that. Mr. Keeble's here from Cooper's Fire. Fire curtains came into the ASFP. Everybody said, "What the hell's a fire curtain?" And you're from dampers, aren't you, Darren? So that's your world, and there's no such thing as a fire-rated smoke damper, is there? Let's not start that debate. So I think an overarching approach will be we will start to engage on that basis. We will probably form at some point a group that could involve significant people, but of course that group has to have value. One of the things we're you have to be a bit careful with is it's great to have 60 people in a room, but if it doesn't deliver any value, how do we actually manage that? So I think we're going to be quite mindful how we manage that particular group. But you are members. This is what you pay for. You pay for this level of engagement. You send an email to us. We may not get to it within 3 hours. I think we're looking at KPIs of a couple of working days for sort of urgent responses. But you're perfectly entitled to send us something and say, there's this course in my particular sector, and would this fit into the framework? But it could be provided by, the National Association of Smoke and Fire Dampers. And as long as it's acceptable, and as long as Kate and David and the rest, the group look at it and say, well, actually, yes, that can fit there. It doesn't have to be an ASFP course. That's acceptable.
Yeah. Thank you.
Next question, please. Do we have another question? Oh, hello.
Hello.
Sorry, I have to strain my eyes. The thing is in the...
Yeah, a couple of questions that came up when I was discussing with other passive fire protection manufacturers and suppliers. One is about design, and I'm interested in what the panel thinks about how a product manufacturer or supplier would end up involving themselves in design, rather than the principal designer or the client. And then sort of following on from that would be, and how would a product manufacturer or supplier end up being, let's say, implicated in possible remedial or remediation costs down the line? What would their involvement have to be for that to come to the door of the product manufacturer or supplier?
Okay, so you manufacture products?
Yes.
Do you install products in the UK?
No.
So you only manufacture products and you supply them to somebody else?
Yes.
And they install them?
Yes.
Okay, because there's two different things here. There's manufacturers that manufacture and install, and of course the whole contractual relationship then comes into play. And then there's obviously people who make things, they test them to the standards that relate to that product, and they sell them and publish the performance data of that product in the way or environment or the use that for its intended purpose that you've tested it for. Okay, I think that's one for Mr. Dr. Taylor.
Sorry, I was trying to find where you were, Chris. I recognised the voice and I couldn't see where you were. So how might you end up with some level of design liability? So I'm trying to think, if somebody came to you and said, fire stop that, and you said, okay, you need BAT, you need mastic, you need X, Y, Z, then even though what you're offering is it may well be a tested solution, but you've still chosen what's going in that hole. If somebody's come to you and said, I want your batten mastic for it to go in that hole, fair enough. But if you're involved in picking the product that goes in the hole, then there's some level of design liability. I would argue there's some level of design liability if you're what's the phrase? If you've got something where this is my tested detail, this is what you're constructing, and what you're constructing is subtly different to my tested detail but covered, you've still got some level of design liability. You may be able to say, well, yes, all right, I've got that, but I'm covered that by tested detail and XAP standard and accepted principle, etc. But there is a level of design there. So there is, and I'm going to send two people into absolute apoplexy now. Sorry, chaps. He even knows I'm looking at him. So one of the questions that I've been asked recently is, if I'm applying an intumescent paint and I've got a piece of steel that I know is section factor 180, and I go to the certificate and I look up the certificate and it tells me to put a millimetre on, is that design liability? And my thought was, no, that's workmanship. Until somebody tests that one out in a court of law, I couldn't swear blind that was the case.
Can I just add a further complication? If you have a product, a series of product, and you design or assist in the design of a special one-off application, and then the client or the principal designer says, okay, I want a certification body to write an assessment of that installation. Does the certification body have an element of design liability as well?
Yes.
These things terrify me, to be honest with you. And I did actually attempt to write a paper on design liability, and I think it went to council and they went, don't touch it with a barge pole. So I think that needs rehabilitating or regurgitating. But certainly the area of design liability, we see it pushed down the supply chain, we see it pushed up the supply chain. And that's somewhere where I think people need to take...
From what Richard was saying, that although contractually it may be doing that, legally it might still be sat with you.
Which is why your comment about the courts is so
joint endeavour.
Yeah.
We don't know until it's given to a man with a white wig. Sorry.
I'm not sure if there's actually a straight answer to this, because there are so many facets involved in whether you would fall foul of being, responsible for part of the design. And there's design with a big D and design with a small d. So gentleman at the front.
Not really required, but want to continue it to say that when we then factor in the expected timescales for Gateway 2 to come in, this needs to be decided or agreed upon fairly quickly. So although I know there is this ambiguity as we just don't know and we think it's here and it might be there, with Gateway 2 potentially coming in January next year or May 24, we need to understand this, or I say we, us as an industry, need to help educate the rest of the construction industry.
Yeah, but I think that the practical difficulties are how liability is considered or assumed in a conversation. So I think in the first session we talked about somebody at a distributor selling building construction products, and if they sell somebody a box of 12 sticks of fire-rated mastic that says FD30 on them, and they say you can use that to put around fire door, are they giving design advice? I'm not going to pick on Mr. Keeble, but I will. Mr. Keeble, when you go into a porter cabin with mace and have a conversation about interfacing a fire curtain, do they consider that conversation a design conversation about how you mechanically and electrically interface that fire curtain with the building structure? Yeah.
They are.
They will take it as you're trying to sell your product. You're trying to help them by making their life easier, and they will sit there and write it all down and say, right, you're now part of the design team.
That's the assumption at the moment.
Yeah. So
that's the default.
It's a really, really ambiguous area, which is why I asked you whether you installed or whether you only supplied, because they are related in two different ways. Giving advice on a product's performance is one level of design responsibility. Will it do the job that it was intended to do? But of course, quite often, you're asking products to go outside of their tested envelope or the standards they were tested to for their intended purpose. Or you're moving a bolt 30 mil to the left, and that 30 mil is not as the product was tested on the furnace at Warrington or one of the other test laboratories, and all of a sudden you've gone outside of the tested envelope, which you've got your certification for. So it is really, really good. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think we're going to resolve that at 3:05 on a Monday morning in early September. Mr. Beavis.
Just to double check and following up, we're a passive fire protection installer. We could have a tender pack from a contractor who tells me they've got an 800 by 400 hole and here are the services that are going through it. We would suggest a fully tested proprietary fire stop solution from a third-party accredited manufacturer. Do we have design liability in that scenario?
I think you do.
Yeah, probably.
I think you do have a level of design responsibility.
Specification
if you
penetrations?
But we've put a fully tested, and we've installed exactly as per manufacturer's guideline.
I think you have a level of design responsibility, but equally the fact that you've picked, if it is a fully tested and you can show, then you've made a design choice, but it's a sensible one. It's of low risk to you. The risk would the risk would flow elsewhere, but it's all within that design piece. But you do have a level of design responsibility because you've made that decision of which that product was.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions on our last the three speakers this afternoon? Do we have any more hands?
Mike, I was just going to add from what you were saying, that you dragged me into the conversation there.
I just like giving you a hard time, Dave
Thank
Keeble,
you.
that's all.
Is that obviously what you're saying is that competency starts with the salespeople or even the person who answers the initial inquiry on the phone. It's not just the manufacturer and the installer, it's every person within that business.
Yes, and it's your meeting with the architect saying, if you want to fill that hole, put this in, and you give the architect information in the brochure, and the architect puts that in the bundle that goes out to tender to the main contractor, and the main contractor then reads it and says, well, that's what it must be.
Yeah, which therefore means that your training program, whatever, has to start at that level of a business.
Yeah, and principal contractor, principal designer, there's levels of responsibility on both parts. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Really, I think that's going to be an interesting one. Any other questions?
I think that's it.
Any brave souls wanting to venture into the world of design liability? It's a swamp. Mr. Boss, are you going to talk about future events coming up? Have you got that? Okay, before you come on then, very, very quickly. So the 25th of November is the ASFP Awards in my hometown of Birmingham. If you've not already bought tickets, is there still tickets available, Georgina Fennell? Is there still tickets available? Yes, there is, for the ASFP Awards. It is the best form of entertainment you will have all year, so please come. Are there any tabletops available, Georgina Fennell? No. All tabletops are sold. The other thing is a London Build. ASFP will be at London Build. If you haven't got a stand, get a stand, because then you might meet Max and myself and you might get on ASFP TV, which is what everybody wants to do. So get yourself a small shell scheme and get some pull-up banners and attend London Build, because it is a slightly more diverse show and you get a slightly more diverse level of attendance that could actually add value to your business other than the typical people you may talk to. Anyway, it's just for me to now just thank our panel for this afternoon. So thank you for all of you for talking. So James, I'm going to get it right, Boone, thank you, never get that right. Dr. Andrew Taylor, the effervescent and my eternal friend Kate Milford, and of course our Niall Rowan as well, who's our Regulatory Affairs Officer. So thank you to them, thank you for you to engage. I'm going to leave you now with my boss, that's Steve Davis, and he's going to just do the final words. Thank you.
So no surprise, we are running late, but I will be very brief, I promise. And without really risking reopening that conversation, very particularly, I think the very fact we're having these conversations about where design liability lies, we know it, where it starts. We actually know. What we want is clarity to say where it's going to stop. So taking engineering best practice in every industry I've sort of been in and applying that, the risk is minimal. When you start winging it and not knowing what products you're applying or installations, that's when the risk grows. And that's really why, the issues that we see in this industry. So, yeah, I don't want to restart that debate, but I thought I'd very quickly do a bit of a recap, covering the guys this morning, because I wrote some bullet points, actually probably more prepared than I ever have been today, listening to this, the speakers we've had today. But I picked out a couple of bits that, partly because I still consider myself new to this industry, and I will keep using that excuse. I'm 18 months into this now, but I am still declared as new. But Chandra this morning mentioned about lots of small steps. And then in the second line mentions, I think it was over 1,000 or 66% of that first submission failing of planning application. That's a lot of small steps to get rid of that problem. You know, this is a very long journey. So some of the stuff that Kate's talked about later on, which I'll touch on as well in a second, we do have a long way to go in this industry. And yes, there's a few comments about, well, there's existing training, there's existing standards, but we know if they were good enough, we wouldn't be having these conversations. If they were robust enough and they were targeted enough to the passive fire industry, this would be easy. The same as it is for gas industry, the same as it is for electricians. There's a hierarchy, there's a structure, there's a piece of paper at the end that says somebody's fit and well to do this job. We don't have that. So, and I say, the work we're trying to do is get ahead of that curve. So, but yeah, lots of small steps. Richard, he wrote it, there's a line on his thing, I copied it word for word. So apparently we're only supposed to appoint competent persons and make sure that they're competent to do the job. And why is that a surprise? You know, the very fact it has to be written down is quite scary. You know, I don't see that in any other industry, but that seems to be perfectly okay to write, and not only just write in a presentation, it's actually out of a document, out of a legislation document, and then into a standard to point out the blindingly obvious that we all know is true. So that was just a wake-up call to think that that's where we're having to move from, if you like, to move on. James touched on a new disruptive technology, if you like, or something that's disrupting the construction sector, and maybe is focusing more on the domestic market, but we saw an example that's moving into the more commercial world. It's something that we talk about internally and trying to get to grips with as to where the ASFP gets involved. Because we've got lots of concerns about it, we've got lots of excitement about it, but we're trying to find a sort of feet around where that fits within our remit and how much or how little we get involved in it. So thanks for the update. And just as a reminder, the reports that James talks about that Make UK issue, if you're a member of the ASFP, you can register for Make UK membership, as Rich will attest to, and you can read these reports. They are there to download. I think most of them are free. Some of them you may have to pay for, but most of them are free if you're a member of Make UK through the ASFP. And then Andy, what can I say? I'm just glad there was no government ministers or any government bodies left in the room when he was presenting, but that's usually the way it goes. So I think what I sort of took from Andy's is the timing is everything with this. You know, the report that I've seen referred to a few times that ASFP wrote all those years ago, there's nothing different in that report to what we're seeing today. But because we are now being driven by a horrific tragedy, suddenly everybody is trying to make things happen. And actually what happened shortly after the tragedy, even when I wasn't involved in this industry, huge shift in almost every sector that's involved in construction about we need to do something to stop this happening again. And slowly that's getting bogged down again in waiting for documents, waiting for papers, waiting for this, and it starts to lose that impetus. It's one of the reasons why, you know, when I first arrived at ASFP, we said, oh, we need to do this, and there's a report coming out. We said, we know what the right thing to do is, just do it. Everything else will catch up eventually. Because actually, if all I'm dealing with is, you know, appoint the right people with the right competence, we can do better than that. So that's why we do drive ahead, and we are trying to make changes as quickly as possible. And it's why these guys, you know, these have actively said we will support this statement, and as our organisation, we'll get involved in helping you do it. So we are starting to move these things forward, but it's glacially slow. Taking the iceberg reference into another little ice world, but. So we have taken the decision, we will recruit, we will get the resources available, we will do the difficult bit and addressing all the concerns about, yes, but what about this, how does this affect me? And as I say, the request to get involved is open. Just ask the question, send an email, and even if you don't come to speak to us directly about it, it will be discussed in the next meeting. So that's the challenge. And then last, Kate, I think the idea of putting, I was a bit concerned about putting Kate last because it's trying to bring a lot of what's reasonably high level, standards, government papers, to try and bring it into a practical level, but still trying to address a huge supply chain. So it still seems quite high level. And I know it's very easy to pass it on, say, yeah, we've got that. We know how that works. When we're talking to an audience like this, it's quite difficult. When we can narrow it down to say, right, we'll get a group of fire stopping companies, we can talk to them about that. We talk about designers, architects. We're able to put that together in a much more coherent basis. So today you've heard probably the third version of that presentation. So it's gone to an exec board, it's gone to council. That's where we got all the support. So it is quite new, and they've asked lots of questions like you did. And we do have most of the answers, but we won't have all of them. So again, it's sort of get involved. So first, again, to thank everyone for speaking today. I know how much time and effort goes into doing this. I know how nervous it is to stand up here. Okay? It's not nice. So thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for the guys for the last...